Okay, ready for a deep dive into a real brain teaser? Today we're tackling a question that's been around for centuries. Is consciousness a thing, separate from our physical selves?
Classic.
We're diving deep into this article by Iris Berent. Consciousness isn't hard. It's human psychology that makes it so.
Oh, that's a good one.
It takes a really interesting approach to this whole debate.
Yeah, it really digs into what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness.
Like, how do you even explain that?
Right. How do you get from something as physical as the brain to something as subjective as, experiencing the color red or the taste of chocolate?
Exactly. Like, those things feel so different.
Totally.
And in this article, it argues that this gut feeling we have that consciousness is separate, it might be more about how our brains work than, a universal truth.
Our intuition isn't always the most reliable guide,
So what are we missing?
Well, Berent points to this thing called intuitive dualism. It's basically this deep down belief that our mind is something, separate from our body, like ethereal or something.
Right. It's like when we say my body, almost like it's this separate thing.
Exactly. It's so ingrained in how we talk, how we think,
We don't even realize we're doing it.
And Berent suggests that really colors how we see consciousness, that separation.
So because we tend to see the mind and body as two different things, then consciousness, which is part of the mind, must also be separate.
That's the gist, yeah. But here's where it gets even more interesting. She says this intuitive dualism, it's not fixed.
Okay, so it can change.
It's what she calls a soft constraint. It can shift depending on what we're focused on, the situation.
So our whole perception of consciousness as separate or not, it's flexible.
In a way, yeah.
That's wild. So how does she figure that out?
She uses these two thought experiments to show this. Zombies, and then there's Mary in the black and white room.
Okay, zombies. Always a fun one to think about. How do they play into this whole consciousness thing?
Okay, so picture a zombie. It looks like a human, acts like one, but it doesn't have consciousness. And what's interesting is that idea, it feels kind of plausible, right?
Yeah, kind of.
We can wrap our heads around it.
Because of that intuitive dualism thing, right? Like, if the mind is separate, it makes sense that it could be missing, even if the body's still there.
Exactly. The zombie example seems to back up that idea that we intuitively separate those things. But then Berent throws a curveball with Mary.
This is where it gets good. For those who haven't heard this one, can you break it down? What's this Mary thought experiment all about?
All right. Imagine this brilliant neuroscientist named Mary. She knows everything about color vision, like all the science, how it works in the brain, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, she's an expert. Got it.
But, and this is the big but, Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room.
Whoa. She's never actually seen color.
Nope. Never experienced it firsthand. And so the big question is, when Mary finally leaves that room and she sees color for the first time, does she gain new knowledge or does she gain a new experience?
I mean, I'd say she gains a new experience.
Right.
Like knowing about something and experiencing it are two different things.
Exactly. And that distinction, that's key here. Because if Mary gains a new experience, something she didn't have, even with all that knowledge, doesn't that suggest that experience is connected to her physical body?
It's like it's her eyes that are now processing those actual light waves, her brain interpreting them. It's not just abstract anymore.
And this is the really cool part. In Berent's research, people rated Mary's experience of color as way more transformative than other types of knowledge.
Because it was tied to her physical self.
Exactly. It wasn't just in her head, so to speak. And this challenges that idea that we always view consciousness as non-physical.
It's like our intuition wants to say one thing with the zombies. Consciousness can just be absent. But then with Mary, it's showing us a different angle, almost like it's all about the context.
And that's exactly Berent's point. Our intuitions about consciousness, even seemingly simple ones, they're way more complex than we might think.
Okay, so that's the thought experiment side of things, but what about actual research? How did Berent test these ideas in a scientific way?
Great question. And this is where things get even more interesting. She designed some really clever experiments. In one of them, she gave people these two scenarios, both involving Mary and that first encounter with color.
Two different versions. Like, how did she change things up with Mary?
Okay, so in both scenarios, Mary, she leaves that black and white room, right? And she sees a red rose for the first time. But here's the twist. One scenario, it describes this whole thing as happening consciously.
Okay.
And the other, it presents it as a subconscious experience. experience.
So in one, she's like aware of seeing the red rose.
Right.
And the other, it's like happening in her mind, but she doesn't realize it.
Exactly. It's kind of like, you know, when you see something out of the corner of your eye,
Yeah.
your brain processes it, but you don't really like consciously register it.
Right.
It's like that, but with color and with Mary. Her brain's getting the information, but she's not having that conscious visual experience.
Got it. So we've got conscious Mary, subconscious Mary. What do people think about these two versions?
Well, when they were asked, like, how transformative each experience was, people thought conscious Mary's experience was way more significant.
Which makes sense. I mean, it's hard to have a transformative experience if you don't even know what's happening.
Right. But it gets better. They also asked people if they thought each experience, you know, conscious or subconscious, would actually show up in a brain scan.
Oh, interesting. So would there be like a measurable difference in her brain activity?
Yes. And get this. People were way more likely to say that conscious Mary's experience, that would show up.
So even though both versions of Mary are like physically processing the same thing, the rose, people still connected the conscious experience to a real change in the brain.
Exactly. It's not about whether she like learned something new. It's about the experience of the color, that aha moment.
It's like that subjective experience is what matters.
And that challenges that whole idea that consciousness is, you know, completely separate from the physical world, right?
Totally. So it sounds like our intuitions about consciousness might be more nuanced than we realize, right?
Way more. And Berent, she didn't stop there. She wanted to dig even deeper into this, so she brought in another character, this amazing artist named Susan. She's got this incredible eye for color.
Okay, an artist. Is Susan stuck in a black and white room too?
No. She's always experienced the world in full color, but she's got this deep, intuitive understanding of how colors work, but like no scientific knowledge.
So the opposite of Mary in a way. Mary's got the book smarts, and Susan's got the like practical, real-world experience.
Exactly. So Berent wanted to see how people would compare Mary's transformation, you know, after seeing that rose for the first time, to Susan's existing knowledge.
Interesting. Like, would they think Susan's color expertise was less important because it wasn't based on, like, conscious scientific knowledge?
Yeah. And the results. Pretty surprising.
So we've heard about all these studies and these thought experiments. What's the takeaway? What's the big takeaway from all this?
You know, it's like Berent is really reminding us that we can't always trust our gut feeling about consciousness. You know, like we shouldn't assume it's giving us the full picture.
It's like we were saying before, it's easy to think of it as separate from the physical world, but then we see how our intuitions can change.
Right, exactly. It's almost like our brains are tricking us a little, you know.
So where do we go from here? If our intuition isn't always right, what are we supposed to use to study something like consciousness?
It's a tough one, right? But that's what makes it so interesting. But the point isn't to stop exploring consciousness. It's just we need to be more aware of these biases, you know?
So we can ask better questions.
Exactly. Instead of getting stuck in the same old arguments, we can look at it from a fresh perspective, maybe even find new ways to study it.
I like that, a fresh perspective. It's been a really thought-provoking deep dive. Makes you think about how we understand, well, anything, really.
It really does. We don't always realize how much our brains are doing behind the scenes, right? And like Berent's work shows, even our most basic intuitions, they're shaped by all these complex processes that we're just starting to figure out.
It makes you wonder what other mysteries we could solve if we took a closer look at, our own psychology. Like, if our brains can trip us up when we're trying to understand our own brains, what else are we missing?
No, that is the question, isn't it?
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive for today. But as always, more questions than answers, right?
That's the beauty of it. Always more to explore.
And to everyone listening, let us know what you think. Have you ever stopped to think about how your own intuition might be, shaping how you see the world? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Until next time, stay curious, everyone. And remember, sometimes the most amazing discoveries come from questioning what we think we already know.